What I want to do in this lesson is talk about the Ancien regime within the sort of framework of pre-revolutionary France. Now, this is going to form part of the first of a series of lessons covering the French Revolution. So this will be for AQA, OCR, and EdXL modules, respectively. They will all have their own playlists, and this series of lessons will be delegated into each of these playlists. Now, specifically, we're going to be exploring the origins of the French Revolution from the period of around 1774, when Louis XVI takes the throne, to the collapse of the Napoleon Empire in 1815. So we're going to go through the origins of the French Revolution in the Ancien regime. We're going to talk about the revolution itself, the series of events that takes place, the reign of terror that takes place after the revolution, and then the rise of Napoleon and the administration and the delegation of the French Empire under the remit and the auspices of Napoleon. So in this lesson specifically, we're going to examine the nature of governance and the general government structure of the Ancien regime in France before the revolution takes place, the concept of absolutism within the monarchical system, as well as some of the realities that existed when it came to the disparity between the absolutism that was expected on the part of Louis XVI and the actual realities of the French system when it came to absolutism. So when we speak of the Ancien regime, what we're actually referring to is just the governance system before the revolution. Pre-revolutionary France is essentially what we're exploring. Now, the reality of the phrase the Ancien regime is actually a pejorative term. It's actually a negative connotation that was used as early as 1790, and this was obviously after the revolution had begun. So the reason why is because it is a pejorative term to refer to the old regime, or the regime that essentially the revolution exists to overcome and to destroy and to quash. And so that's why it was seen as a pejorative term when it is used in 1790. But it is now the almost the historically accepted term for the period of France from the beginning of the reign of Louis XVI all the way up to the revolution, the Ancien regime. Now, it was very much a monarchy, the Ancien regime, and it was specifically the monarchy of King Louis XVI of France. Now, Louis XVI was an absolute monarch, and when we talk about absolute monarchy, we have to make a number of different considerations and put in place a number of different caveats when it comes to King Louis XVI's reign specifically. So, in theory, when we talk about an absolutist monarchy, we are talking about the fact that the monarch had no legal limits to the power that they could exert and initiate with their own authority. Now, we can see the ideas of absolutism when we look at the coronation of King Louis XVI. When he was coronated, he swore an oath to God and not an oath to the people of France, a sort of symbolic signification that the power of Louis XVI derived from God and not from that of the people. Now, of course, the people would have a problem with that when we see the revolution take place, but this is generally seen as an indication or quite symbolic of an absolute monarchy. In reality, though, absolutism was actually quite limited for Louis XVI, because he took a lot of advice from a lot of experienced advisors, and of course this would give the select advisors that were in question, that he took advice from, a certain amount of power and authority, considering that he would listen to his advisors, and on that basis he would make decisions as to the direction of different policy. And so the experienced advisors in question would have a certain amount of power within this system. He was also still bound to follow a number of different laws and customs that had been previously established in France, with a number of different systems that existed, and we'll talk about those in a little minute. And the final thing is, just like with essentially all monarchies within an absolutist framework, in order for King Louis XVI to rule effectively and to rule without being overthrown, he would need the consent of the nobility. Just like with any other king within any other state before it, if there's a strong nobility, then there is always a threat to the power of the monarchy, considering that the nobility are the richest within society, and they have the ability to challenge the king if the king is acting in a way that they dislike. In terms of the character and the general life of Louis XVI himself, we know that he was born in Versailles in 1754, and as a result of the fact that his older brother and his father had both died quite early, he would eventually take the crown from his grandfather in 1774. So he would sort of skip the queue, if you will, of his father and his older brother and take the crown himself in 1774. He was generally well educated. He was fluent in both English and Italian, as well as French, of course. And in 1770, before he took the throne, he married a controversial figure. And this was Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie Antoinette is a controversial figure within the pre-revolutionary France for the simple fact that she was the daughter of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa. Now, the reason why they were not a big fan of this, the daughter of an Austrian empress marrying a French monarch, was because the French were hostile to Austria, since at the time they blamed Austria for the French defeat in the 7 Years' War, which had taken place slightly before both the marriage to Marie Antoinette and also the ascension of Louis XVI to the throne in 1774. So the 7 Years' War was 1753 to 1763. Interestingly, it's called the 7 Years' War, but it wasn't exactly 7 years, just like the 100 Years' War isn't 100 years, and the 30 Years' War wasn't exactly 30 years either. So we have all of these different things taking place. We have a little bit of controversy in regards to the marriage of Louis XVI to Marie Antoinette, but generally speaking, he was generally at the start of his reign relatively well liked in terms of his general popularity and his general demeanor. Now, as I've mentioned, we ought to talk about the general government structure that existed within the Ancien regime before we start to talk about the problems within society and the problems within the economy as the regime itself starts to collapse into revolution. So, as noted previously, while it was an absolutist system on paper, there were still nevertheless limits to the authority through the government structure of the Ancien regime. So the government itself had operated out of the Palace of Versailles, which was around 12 miles outside of Paris, and Louis XVI himself did not choose to conduct government through a cabinet-style meeting of ministers. Instead, he would meet with individual ministers one at a time, or maybe two or three at a time. Similar to, if those of you who are taking A-level politics, similar to Tony Blair's style of government in terms of preferring to meet with single cabinet ministers rather than meeting with multiple ministers, Louis XVI was very similar. He would meet with individuals instead of choosing to have large cabinet-style ministerial meetings with the whole of the government. But the real recurring problem that had existed for Louis XVI when it came to the governance structure of France was the fact that there existed a lot of disparities and complexities regarding the laws and customs of France at the time. There was also the establishment of 36 generalities when it came to the establishment of these by previous French monarchs. So what this essentially did was split the country into 36 different sectors, each of which under the administration of a royal official called an intendant. Now, the problem with this, of course, is the fact that there are a lot of disparities and complexities that exist with the different rules within each of these 36 sectors. So given the differences in the legal system due to the different structures in terms of French customs, and B, due to the fact that we have these 36 different systems and sectors that have been established by previous monarchs, there were arguments against the idea that Louis was truly an absolutist monarch at the time of the revolution, because we have this problem that would become a recurring problem for Louis XVI, especially when it came to the administration of economic policy from a centralized government structure, from the centralized system of the Palace of Versailles. We see that being able to administer economic policy and to collect taxes, for example, would be difficult due to the fact that we have these 36 different sectors, and we also have the fact that there is a number of truly different laws and customs within different areas of France itself. So this would really start to show some cracks in the structure of the society at the time, but it will be other issues that will ultimately lead to the downfall of the Ancien regime and the devolving into a revolution.